When my son passed away, I sheltered my daughter-in-law in our house. A week later, she showed up with a new boyfriend. At the family dinner, my daughter-in-law introduced my wife as the maid hired out of charity. I stood up and did something that made her go pale. Subscribe to the channel for more stories like this and comment the city you're watching from. I never imagined that at 65 years old, I would be preparing my son's funeral. Edward Thomas Mitchell Jr. had been my pride and joy for 32 years. When the phone rang that Tuesday morning in March, I was in my study reading the newspaper, and Margaret was in the kitchen making her famous blueberry pancakes. The kind of ordinary morning that becomes extraordinary only because it's the last one before everything changes forever. "Mr. Mitchell, this is Officer Davidson from the State Police. I'm calling about your son, Thomas." My hands began to shake before he even finished explaining. A drunk driver had run a red light at the intersection of Main and 5th. Thomas was heading to work, probably thinking about the presentation he had to give that afternoon, or wondering what Miranda was making for dinner. He died instantly, they said, as if that was supposed to be a comfort. The funeral was a blur of black clothes and tear-stained faces. Thomas had touched so many lives in his 32 years. His colleagues from the law firm, college friends who had driven in from 3 states away, neighbors who remembered him mowing their lawns as a teenager. But it was Miranda who broke my heart the most. She stood beside the casket in a simple black dress, her dark hair pulled back, looking so fragile I thought she might shatter if the wind blew too hard. 28 years old and suddenly a widow. She had been married to Thomas for only 4 years, but I could see the devastation in her brown eyes. She barely spoke during the service, just nodded when people offered their condolences. After the burial, she approached Margaret and me at the cemetery. "I don't know what I'm going to do," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind rustling through the oak trees. "Everything reminds me of him." The apartment, his coffee mug still in the sink, his books. She broke down completely then, sobbing into Margaret's shoulder. That night, Margaret and I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, both of us unable to sleep. "We can't just leave her alone," Margaret said, her voice thick with her own grief. "Thomas would want us to take care of her." I knew she was right. Thomas had always been protective of Miranda, the way he'd light up when he talked about her, how he'd bring her flowers for no reason at all. If we could no longer take care of our son, the least we could do was take care of the woman he loved. The next morning, I called Miranda. "Pack your things," I told her. "You're coming to stay with us for as long as you need." There was silence on the other end, then quiet crying. "Are you sure? I don't want to be a burden." "You're not a burden, sweetheart. You're family." She moved in that weekend. Margaret had prepared the guest room on the 2nd floor, the one with the big windows that looked out over the garden Thomas had helped me plant when he was in high school. Miranda arrived with just 2 suitcases and a cardboard box of Thomas's things she couldn't bear to leave behind. For the first few days, she barely came out of the room. Margaret would take her meals up on a tray, and we'd hear her crying through the thin walls. It reminded me of when Thomas was little and had nightmares. Margaret would sit with him until he fell back asleep, humming the same lullaby her mother had sung to her. Gradually, Miranda started joining us for dinner. She would sit quietly, picking at her food, occasionally sharing a memory about Thomas, how he used to burn the eggs every Sunday morning when he tried to make breakfast in bed for her, how he would read legal briefs out loud in funny voices to make her laugh, small things that meant everything. He used to say you taught him how to be a good man, she told me one evening, as we sat on the front porch watching the sun set. He said he wanted to be the kind of husband and father you were. My throat tightened. Thomas and I had been close, but like most fathers and sons, we didn't talk about feelings much. Hearing that he'd noticed, that he'd valued the example I tried to set, meant more than I could express. He was already a good man, I managed to say. That was all him. Miranda nodded, tears sliding down her cheeks. I keep waiting for him to come home. Every day around 6 o'clock, I still listen for his car in the driveway. Margaret reached over and squeezed her hand. The grief gets easier to carry, honey. It never goes away, but it gets easier. For 3 weeks, this was our routine. Margaret and I trying to create some semblance of normalcy while Miranda slowly began to heal. She started helping with small tasks around the house, insisted on doing her own laundry, even cooked dinner one night. It was Thomas's favorite meal, pot roast with carrots and potatoes. She cried while she made it, but she finished it. I began to think we were all going to be okay, that we could honor Thomas's memory by taking care of each other, by being the family he would have wanted us to be. I should have known that grief makes people do unpredictable things. I should have seen the signs, but I was so focused on my own pain, on trying to support Margaret through hers, that I missed the subtle changes in Miranda's behavior. The way she started checking her phone constantly during dinner, how she began disappearing for hours at a time, claiming she needed to handle Thomas's affairs or meet with lawyers, the new clothes that appeared in her wardrobe, brighter colors that seemed inappropriate for someone in mourning. Looking back, I realized the first real warning sign came on a Thursday evening in late April. Miranda was setting the table for dinner when she suddenly stopped and stared at Thomas's empty chair. "Maybe we should move his chair," she said, her voice oddly detached. "It's depressing having it there every night." Margaret and I exchanged a look. We'd both found comfort in keeping Thomas's place at the table, as if he might walk through the door at any moment and join us. "We could put it in the garage for now," Margaret suggested gently. "If you're not ready to look at it," Miranda shrugged. "Or we could just get rid of it. It's not like he's coming back." The casualness in her voice made my stomach clench. This wasn't healthy processing of grief. This was something else entirely. But I told myself she was just trying to cope in her own way, that everyone handles loss differently. I wish I'd trusted my instincts. I wish I'd realized that the woman crying in my wife's arms at the cemetery was already planning her next move. Because less than a week later, Miranda would prove that some people see tragedy not as devastation, but as opportunity. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning, exactly 1 week after Miranda's comment about Thomas's chair. I was in the garage organizing tools when I heard Margaret answer the kitchen extension. "Oh, hi, Miranda. You're bringing someone for dinner tonight?" "Of course, sweetheart. The more the company, the better." When I came inside, Margaret was already planning the menu in her head, that focused look she got when she wanted everything to be perfect. "Miranda is bringing a friend tonight, someone named Derek who's been helping her with Thomas's paperwork." Something cold settled in my stomach. What kind of paperwork? Margaret shrugged, already pulling ingredients from the pantry. "Legal things, I suppose. Insurance claims, closing accounts. You know how complicated these things can be." I did know. When my father died 15 years earlier, it had taken months to sort through everything, but Thomas had been organized, meticulous about his records. And Miranda had already told us that Thomas's law firm was handling most of the estate matters as a courtesy. Did she say anything else about this, Derek? Just that he's been very helpful. "I think it's good that she's making new friends. She can't stay isolated forever." That evening, Miranda came downstairs at exactly 6 o'clock, wearing a dress I'd never seen before. It was deep blue, fitted, with a neckline that seemed more appropriate for a date than a family dinner with her deceased husband's parents. She'd done something different with her hair, too, curled it and pinned it up in a way that made her look older, more sophisticated. "You look lovely, dear," Margaret said, but I caught the slight questioning tone in her voice. Miranda smiled, a bright expression that seemed almost manic. "Derek should be here any minute. He's really excited to meet you both." The doorbell rang at 6:15. Through the front window, I saw a man in his early 30s getting out of a black sports car. He was tall, lean, with styled brown hair and the kind of confident posture that usually came with money or privilege. When Miranda opened the door, he handed her a bouquet of white roses and kissed her cheek. Not the kind of kiss you give to someone you're helping with paperwork. "Edward, Margaret, this is Derek Collins," Miranda said, her arm linking through his with casual familiarity. "Derek, these are Thomas's parents I told you about." Derek's handshake was firm, his smile practiced. "So sorry for your loss. Miranda has told me so much about Thomas. He sounded like an amazing guy." Well, the past tense felt wrong coming from a stranger, but I pushed down my discomfort and invited him in. Dinner started pleasantly enough. Derek was charming, asking thoughtful questions about our lives, complimenting Margaret's cooking with the enthusiasm of someone trying to make a good impression. He worked in real estate development, he explained, which was how he'd met Miranda. Miranda was looking into selling the apartment, he said, cutting into his steak. The memories were just too painful. I've been helping her find something smaller, more manageable. I set down my fork. You're selling the apartment? The one you shared with Thomas? Miranda's smile faltered for just a moment. It's too big for just me. And like Derek said, the memories. She trailed off, looking at her plate. But Thomas loved that apartment, Margaret said softly. He was so proud when you two moved in. He spent weeks picking out paint colors. People move on, Margaret, Miranda said, her voice carrying a slight edge. It's what healthy people do. The rebuke hung in the air like smoke. Margaret's face flushed, and I felt my jaw tighten. But Derek smoothly changed the subject, asking about my years as a high school principal, and the moment passed. After dinner, I excused myself to the kitchen to help Margaret with the dishes, leaving Miranda and Derek alone in the living room. Through the doorway, I could see them sitting close together on the couch, Derek's hand resting on Miranda's knee, while she laughed at something he was saying. They seem very comfortable with each other, Margaret whispered, scrubbing a plate with unnecessary force. I watched as Derek leaned in to whisper something in Miranda's ear, his lips nearly touching her skin. She giggled like a teenager, her hand finding his arm. Too comfortable, I muttered. When we returned to the living room, Derek was telling Miranda about a restaurant he wanted to take her to, something about how she deserved to be treated properly. The intimacy in his voice, the way she was looking at him with sparkling eyes, made my chest tight with anger. This wasn't a man helping a grieving widow with paperwork. This was a man courting a woman, and the woman was responding enthusiastically. Derek left around 9:30, but not before making plans to take Miranda to lunch the next day. After his car pulled out of the driveway, the three of us stood in the foyer in awkward silence. He seems nice, Margaret finally said, but her tone suggested she was trying to convince herself. Miranda's smile was radiant. He is. He's been such a blessing during this difficult time. A blessing. 4 weeks after burying her husband, she was calling another man a blessing. Miranda, I began carefully, I hope you're not rushing into anything. Grief can make us vulnerable to what? Her voice turned sharp, defensive. To kindness? To someone who actually cares about my happiness? The implication stung. We care about your happiness. We've opened our home to you, tried to support you through this. And I'm grateful, she interrupted, but her tone suggested otherwise. But I can't live in the past forever. Thomas wouldn't want me to. She was right about that. Thomas would want her to be happy eventually, but this felt different, wrong somehow. The timing, the secrecy about selling the apartment, the way she looked at Derek like she was drowning, and he was a life raft. After Miranda went upstairs, Margaret and I sat at the kitchen table with cold cups of coffee, both of us processing what we'd witnessed. Maybe I'm being unfair, Margaret said quietly. People grieve differently. Maybe this is her way of coping. Ollie, I wanted to agree, wanted to give Miranda the benefit of the doubt. But something in my gut told me this wasn't grief. This was something else entirely. Did you notice her dress tonight? The way she did her hair? Margaret nodded slowly. She looked beautiful, but not like someone in mourning. Over the next few days, Derek became a regular presence in our house. He picked Miranda up for lunch dates that stretched into the afternoon. He brought her flowers, small gifts, books of poetry that made her blush when she read them. He called her every morning and every night, conversations that sent her retreating to her room with girlish laughter echoing through the walls. The transformation in Miranda was remarkable and disturbing. The broken woman who had sobbed in Margaret's arms just weeks earlier was gone, replaced by someone animated, flirtatious, completely absorbed in her new romance. She stopped mentioning Thomas altogether. His photos, which had been prominently displayed on her dresser, disappeared into drawers. The box of his personal items that she'd brought with her gathered dust in the corner of her room. When Margaret gently asked if she wanted to visit his grave, Miranda said she wasn't ready yet, but her tone suggested she had no intention of going. The final straw came on a Friday evening. Derek had taken Miranda to dinner at an expensive restaurant downtown, and they returned to the house around 10 o'clock, both of them slightly tipsy and giggly. I was reading in the living room when they stumbled through the front door, Derek's arm around Miranda's waist, her head leaning against his shoulder. They were so absorbed in each other that they didn't notice me sitting in the wingback chair by the window. "Your room or mine?" Derek whispered, his hand sliding down to rest on the small of Miranda's back. Miranda giggled, standing on her tiptoes to kiss his neck. "Yours. These walls are thin and I don't want to wake the old folks." The old folks, Margaret and I, who had opened our home to her, who had held her while she cried, who had rearranged our entire lives to accommodate her grief. We were just the old folks now, inconvenient obstacles to her new happiness. I cleared my throat loudly, and they sprang apart like guilty teenagers. "Oh, Edward," Miranda said, her cheeks flushed. "We didn't see you there." "Apparently not." I set down my book and stood up, feeling every one of my 65 years in my aching joints. "Derek, I think it's time for you to go home." His easy smile faltered. Of course, I was just making sure Miranda got in safely. After he left, Miranda turned to face me, her expression defiant rather than embarrassed. "You don't approve," she said. It wasn't a question. "It's not my place to approve or disapprove of your choices," I said carefully. "But Thomas has been gone for less than 5 weeks. And how long am I supposed to wait?" she snapped. "How long am I supposed to pretend to be the grieving widow for your benefit?" The words hit me like a physical blow. Pretend to be the grieving widow, as if her tears at the funeral had been an act, as if her devastation had been performance for our benefit. "Miranda, I know you loved my son." "I did love him," she interrupted. "But he's gone, Edward. And I'm still here, still alive, still young enough to have a future. I won't apologize for that." She swept upstairs, leaving me standing alone in the living room, finally understanding that the woman we'd taken into our home was not the woman Thomas had married. Or maybe she was exactly who she'd always been, and grief had just stripped away her ability to hide it. Either way, I was beginning to realize that inviting Miranda to stay with us hadn't been an act of kindness. It had been a mistake that was about to cost us more than I could have ever imagined. Margaret's sister, Catherine, had been planning her 60th birthday celebration for months. She'd sent the invitation back in January, when life was normal and Thomas was still alive, still calling every Sunday to check on us, still making plans to bring Miranda for Christmas dinner. The party was set for the first Saturday in May at Catherine's Country Club, with family coming in from as far as Oregon and Florida. "We should probably skip it," Margaret said, holding the reminder card that had arrived in Thursday's mail. "Catherine will understand." I looked up from my morning coffee, considering. We hadn't been anywhere social since the funeral. The thought of making small talk, of explaining Thomas's absence over and over again, felt exhausting. But Catherine was Margaret's only sister, and they'd been close their entire lives. "Maybe it would be good for us," I said finally. "Get out of the house, see some familiar faces." Miranda appeared in the kitchen doorway, already dressed for another lunch date with Derek. She'd taken to wearing makeup every day now, her hair always perfectly styled, her clothes carefully chosen. The transformation from grieving widow to woman in love was complete. "What would be good for you?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Catherine's birthday party," Margaret explained. "It's this Saturday at the Hillcrest Country Club. You're welcome to come, of course. Catherine specifically asked about you in her card." Miranda's face lit up with interest. "A country club party? That sounds lovely. Derek has been wanting to meet more of the family." My stomach clenched. "You want to bring Derek?" "Well, yes. We're together now, Edward. It would be strange to go alone." "Together now?" 6 weeks after burying her husband, she was openly declaring herself in a relationship with another man. Margaret set down her coffee cup carefully. "Miranda, honey, I'm not sure that's appropriate. This is a family gathering, and Derek isn't..." "Isn't what?" Miranda's voice carried a warning edge. "Isn't family? Because Thomas is dead, I'm no longer part of your family?" The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that for a moment I almost fell for it myself, making herself the victim when she was the one being inappropriate. That's not what Margaret meant, I said firmly. You'll always be family, but bringing a new boyfriend to a family event so soon after Thomas's death might be uncomfortable for people. Miranda's eyes flashed with anger. So I'm supposed to hide Derek? Pretend he doesn't exist? Pretend I'm still the mourning widow you want me to be? I'm not asking you to hide anything. I'm asking you to consider other people's feelings. She laughed, a bitter sound. Other people's feelings. What about my feelings, Edward? What about my right to be happy? The argument might have escalated, but Derek's car horn honked in the driveway, ending the conversation. Miranda grabbed her purse and headed for the door. I'll let you know about Saturday, she called over her shoulder. Derek and I need to discuss our plans. After she left, Margaret and I sat in silence for a long time. She's going to bring him, Margaret said finally. I know. What are we going to do? I didn't have an answer. Miranda wasn't technically doing anything wrong. She was a grown woman, free to date whomever she chose. But the timing, the circumstances, the complete disregard for how it might affect us or Thomas's memory felt like a betrayal. Saturday arrived with perfect spring weather. Margaret spent the morning getting ready, changing outfits 3 times before settling on a navy blue dress with pearls. I could see her anxiety in the way she fussed with her hair, applied and reapplied her lipstick. Maybe Miranda will come to her senses, she said as we drove to the club. Maybe she'll leave Derek at home. But when we pulled into the parking lot of the Hillcrest Country Club, Derek's black sports car was already there. The party was being held in the club's main dining room, decorated with white and gold balloons and centerpieces of yellow roses. Catherine had invited nearly 50 people, a mix of family, longtime friends, and members of her various social clubs. The room buzzed with conversation and laughter. Miranda and Derek were standing near the bar, both impeccably dressed. Miranda wore a red cocktail dress that hugged her figure, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon. Derek was in a charcoal gray suit, looking every inch the successful businessman. They made a striking couple, and I could see heads turning in their direction. Oh, good. You made it. Catherine rushed over to greet us, resplendent in a sequined gold dress. I was worried you might not come. She lowered her voice. How are you holding up? Some days are better than others, Margaret replied, accepting her sister's hug. Catherine's eyes drifted toward Miranda and Derek. Is that Miranda? She looks well. The understatement hung in the air. Miranda didn't just look well. She looked radiant, glowing with happiness in a way that seemed almost obscene given the circumstances. She's been staying with us, I explained. This is Derek, her friend. Catherine's eyebrows rose slightly, but she was too polite to comment directly. Well, why don't you come meet the Hendersons? They just moved here from Phoenix. For the next hour, we made our way through the party, catching up with relatives we hadn't seen in months, sharing memories of Thomas with those who asked. Several people approached us with condolences, kind words about our son that both comforted and wounded. Miranda and Derek worked the room like politicians, charming everyone they met. I watched Derek regale a group of Catherine's golf partners with stories about his real estate ventures, while Miranda laughed at all the right moments, her hand resting possessively on his arm. It was Margaret's cousin Robert who first made the connection that would lead to disaster. That's Miranda, he asked, nodding toward the bar where she and Derek were getting fresh drinks. Thomas's wife? Yes, Margaret replied quietly. Robert's expression grew puzzled. But didn't Thomas just pass away recently? Last month? 6 weeks ago, I said. Robert looked back at Miranda, who was now feeding Derek a cherry from her cocktail, while he whispered something in her ear that made her laugh. And she's here with another man? The question carried across our small circle, and I saw other family members turning to look. The whispers started then, subtle but persistent. I could feel people's eyes on us, could sense the gossip beginning to spread. The situation reached its breaking point during Catherine's toast. Everyone gathered in the center of the room as Catherine stood on a small platform, champagne glass raised. She began with the usual birthday speech, thanking everyone for coming, sharing funny stories about getting older, expressing gratitude for family and friends. I'm especially grateful to have my sister Margaret here tonight, Catherine continued, during what I know has been an incredibly difficult time for her and Edward. Losing Thomas was a shock to all of us, and I want everyone to know how proud I am of Margaret's strength and grace. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Several people raised their glasses toward Margaret, who smiled weakly and nodded in acknowledgement. "And of course," Catherine continued, "we're glad to have Miranda here as well. Thomas's widow will always be part of our family." That's when it happened. Miranda stepped forward, Derek at her side, and raised her own glass. "Thank you, Catherine. That's so sweet." Her voice carried clearly across the room. "I'd like everyone to meet my boyfriend, Derek Collins." A collective intake of breath swept through the gathering. I felt Margaret stiffen beside me, but Miranda wasn't finished. "Derek has been such a support during this transition," she continued, her voice growing stronger, more confident, "and I especially want to thank Margaret, who has been wonderful to me. She's like the hired help, really, so devoted, so caring. Edward pays her to take care of the house and cook for us, and she does it with such charity." The silence that followed was deafening. I felt the blood drain from my face as the meaning of her words sank in. She had just introduced my wife of 42 years, the mother of my deceased son, as hired help, domestic staff that I paid out of charity. Margaret's face went white, then flushed deep red. Her champagne glass trembled in her hand. The crowd stood frozen, unsure how to react to this social catastrophe. Some people looked confused, others horrified. Catherine's mouth hung open in shock. "Margaret isn't hired help," I said, my voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "She's my wife. She's Thomas's mother. And she opened our home to you when you had nowhere else to go." Miranda's smile didn't waver. "Of course she is. I was just being playful." But her eyes held a cold triumph that told me the insult had been completely intentional. Derek, to his credit, looked uncomfortable for the first time since I'd met him. He whispered something in Miranda's ear, but she shrugged him off. "Anyway," she said brightly, "here's to new beginnings and letting go of the past." She drained her champagne glass in one gulp, while the rest of the room stood in stunned silence. I felt something snap inside me. This woman had taken our grief, our generosity, our love for our son, and twisted it into something ugly. She had humiliated my wife in front of 50 people, reduced her to a servant in her own family. But more than that, she had revealed something about herself that I should have seen sooner. This wasn't grief making her act inappropriately. This wasn't a young woman struggling to cope with loss. This was someone who felt entitled to use other people's pain for her own benefit. I walked over to where Miranda stood, still smiling that cold, triumphant smile. When I reached her, I placed my hand firmly on her shoulder. "We need to talk," I said quietly. "Now." Her smile faltered slightly, but she nodded. "Of course, Edward." As we walked toward a quiet corner of the room, I could feel every eye in the place following us. Margaret remained where I'd left her, surrounded by family members who were trying to offer comfort and support. But I wasn't thinking about the embarrassment anymore. I wasn't thinking about the gossip or the awkward explanations we'd have to make. I was thinking about the look in Miranda's eyes when she'd called Margaret hired help, the satisfaction, the pleasure she'd taken in delivering that blow. And I was thinking about what I was going to do about it. The conversation in the corner of Catherine's birthday party was brief and tense. Miranda maintained her innocent act, claiming she'd been misunderstood, that her words had come out wrong due to nervousness and champagne. But I could see the calculating intelligence behind her apologetic expression, the way she watched me to gauge whether I was buying her performance. I wasn't. We left the party early, driving home in heavy silence. Margaret stared out the passenger window, her shoulders rigid with humiliation. Miranda sat in the back seat, occasionally sighing dramatically, as if she were the injured party. Once we arrived home, Miranda disappeared to her room without another word. Margaret went straight to the kitchen and began aggressively cleaning counters that were already spotless, her way of processing anger and hurt. 42 years of marriage, she muttered, scrubbing the same spot over and over. 42 years, and she makes me sound like the cleaning lady. I wanted to comfort her, but I was too angry to form coherent words. Instead, I went to my study and closed the door, needing space to think clearly about what had just happened. The next morning, Sunday, Miranda emerged from her room with red-rimmed eyes and a contrite expression. She found Margaret and me having coffee on the back porch, enjoying the quiet morning air. "I owe you both an enormous apology," she began, her voice shaky with what appeared to be genuine emotion. "I don't know what came over me last night. I think I've been so overwhelmed with grief and trying to move forward that I said something completely inappropriate." Margaret looked up from her coffee cup, hope flickering in her eyes. She wanted to believe Miranda's remorse was real. "The truth is," Miranda continued, "I've been feeling guilty about Derek, about moving on so quickly. I think I was trying to minimize how much you both meant to me because it's easier than admitting how lost I'd be without you." It was a masterful performance, the right amount of vulnerability, the perfect explanation for her behavior. If I hadn't seen the cold satisfaction in her eyes the night before, I might have believed it myself. Margaret, always ready to forgive, reached out and squeezed Miranda's hand. "We all say things we don't mean when we're hurting, sweetheart." "Thank you for understanding," Miranda said, tears sliding down her cheeks. "I promise it won't happen again." But I wasn't ready to forgive and forget. Something about the entire situation felt wrong, like a puzzle with pieces that didn't fit together properly. So I began to pay closer attention to the details. I noticed that Miranda's crying spells always seemed to coincide with moments when Margaret or I expressed doubt about her behavior. I observed how quickly she could switch from devastated widow to glowing girlfriend, depending on whether Derek was around. Most telling was the way she spoke about Thomas, or rather, how little she spoke about him at all. 2 weeks after the country club incident, my suspicions crystallized into action. Miranda had gone out with Derek for the afternoon, claiming they were looking at apartments. Margaret was visiting her sister, trying to repair relationships damaged by Miranda's public humiliation. I found myself alone in the house for the first time since Miranda had moved in, and I made a decision that would change everything. I went upstairs to Miranda's room. I told myself I was just checking to make sure she had everything she needed, that I wasn't snooping. But as I stood in the doorway, looking at the space that had once been our guest room, I felt compelled to understand who this woman really was. The room was meticulously clean, almost sterile. Thomas's photos had been relegated to a single frame on the nightstand, face down. The box of his personal items that she'd brought with her sat in the closet, pushed behind her hanging clothes, as if hidden from view. But it was the desk by the window that caught my attention. Miranda had been using it as a workspace, claiming she needed to organize Thomas's papers and handle his affairs. What I found there shattered every assumption I'd made about my son's marriage. The first thing I discovered was a stack of letters tied with a blue ribbon tucked inside one of the desk drawers. Love letters, written in a masculine handwriting that definitely wasn't Thomas's. My hands shook as I untied the ribbon and read the first letter. "My dearest Miranda," it began, "I can't stop thinking about last weekend. Being with you makes me realize what I've been missing my entire life. I know the situation is complicated, but I believe we're meant to be together." The letter was signed, "Forever yours, Derek," and dated 3 months earlier, 3 months before Thomas died. With growing dread, I read through the entire stack, 27 letters in total, spanning from January through March. Love letters filled with intimate details, future plans, and promises. Derek writing about how he couldn't wait until Miranda was free to be with him completely. Miranda apparently responding with equal passion, though her letters weren't in the stack. The final letter was dated March 15th, just 5 days before Thomas's accident. "I know you're scared about telling him," Derek had written, "but we can't keep living this lie. You deserve to be happy, Miranda. We both do. Whatever happens, I'll be here for you." My legs gave out, and I sank into the desk chair, the letters scattered across my lap. Miranda had been having an affair. For months before Thomas died, she'd been planning to leave him for Derek, but there was more. Beneath the letters, I found a manila folder labeled "Legal Documents." Inside were papers I didn't recognize at first. Property assessments, insurance valuations, financial statements, all related to Thomas's assets. And at the bottom of the folder, a document that made my blood run cold. It was a life insurance application dated February 28th. Thomas's signature was at the bottom, but the handwriting on the application itself was Miranda's. She had applied for a $500,000 life insurance policy on my son without telling him what it was really worth. The signature looked rushed, casual, as if Thomas had signed it without reading it carefully. The beneficiary was listed as Miranda Holloway, with a secondary beneficiary listed as Estate of Thomas Mitchell, Jr., in much smaller print. I stared at the document until the words blurred together. Miranda hadn't just been cheating on Thomas. She had been systematically preparing for his death, ensuring she would be financially secure when he was gone. The insurance policy had been approved on March 20th, the same day Thomas died. My hands trembled as I photographed every document with my phone, then carefully returned everything to its original position. I needed time to think, to process what I'd discovered. I made it downstairs just as Margaret returned from Catherine's house, her face drawn with exhaustion. "How did it go?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Catherine understands, but some of the family—" Margaret shook her head. "They're asking questions, Edward, about Miranda, about her behavior at the party. I didn't know what to tell them." "Tell them the truth," I said, "that we're dealing with a complicated situation." Margaret looked at me sharply. "You sound different. Did something happen while I was gone?" I wanted to tell her everything, to share the devastating discovery that was burning inside me like acid, but I couldn't. Not yet. Not until I understood the full scope of what Miranda had done. "I'm just tired," I lied. "It's been a long few months." That evening, Derek came for dinner as usual. I watched him across our dining room table, this man who had been courting my son's wife while Thomas was still alive. His easy charm now seemed sinister, his attentiveness to Miranda taking on a different meaning. "So Derek," I said casually, cutting into my pot roast, "how exactly did you and Miranda meet?" They exchanged a quick glance before Derek answered. "Through a mutual friend, someone who thought we'd get along." "When was this?" Another glance. "Recently," Miranda said quickly, "after Thomas passed." The lie came so easily, so smoothly, that I wondered how many others I'd been told. How many times had they sat at my table, eaten my food, accepted my hospitality, while lying directly to my face? Later that night, after Derek left and Miranda had gone upstairs, I sat in my study with the photos I'd taken of the documents. The evidence was overwhelming, but it raised more questions than it answered. Had Thomas known about the affair? Had he suspected something was wrong in his marriage? I thought about our last conversation just 3 days before he died. He'd seemed distracted, troubled about something he wouldn't discuss. "Everything okay at home?" I'd asked him. "Yeah, Dad, just work stress," he'd replied. But now I wondered if that was another lie, told to protect me from a painful truth. The insurance policy bothered me most. The timing was too convenient, too calculated. Miranda had increased Thomas's life insurance just weeks before his death, then immediately began a very public relationship with her secret lover. I needed to know more. I needed to understand exactly what had happened to my son and what role Miranda might have played in his death. But first, I had to decide what to do with the knowledge I'd gained. Confronting Miranda directly would only put her on guard, might cause her to destroy evidence or disappear altogether. Going to the police with suspicions wasn't enough. I needed proof of actual wrongdoing. As I sat there in the dark, staring at the photos on my phone, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my son's death had been wrong. Thomas hadn't died in a random accident. He had died while his wife was planning to leave him, while she was securing her financial future, while she was building a new life with another man. Whether Miranda had been directly involved in the accident or not, she had certainly been prepared for it, and that preparation suggested a level of calculation that made my skin crawl. I thought about Thomas's last few weeks, how he'd seemed withdrawn, distracted. I thought about Miranda's immediate acceptance of our invitation to move in, how quickly she'd transitioned from grief to romance. And I thought about what I was going to do to the woman who had destroyed my son's happiness, manipulated our grief, and was now living under our roof as if she belonged there. Because one thing had become crystal clear. Miranda wasn't the victim in this story, Thomas was. and someone needed to make sure she paid for what she'd done to him. For 3 days after discovering the letters and insurance documents, I carried the weight of knowledge like a stone in my chest. I watched Miranda move through our house with new eyes, seeing calculation where I'd once seen grief, manipulation where I'd once seen vulnerability. Every smile she offered Margaret, every grateful comment about our generosity, every tear she shed over Thomas's memory now felt like a performance. The hardest part was maintaining normalcy around Margaret. She had noticed my distraction, my sudden tendency to go quiet during conversations, but she attributed it to my own grieving process. I let her believe that rather than burden her with suspicions I couldn't yet prove. On Wednesday evening, Derek arrived for dinner with an expensive bottle of wine and news that made my blood pressure spike. "I have something exciting to share," he announced, as Margaret served her famous lasagna. "I found the perfect apartment for Miranda, a beautiful 2-bedroom in the Riverside district with a view of the water." Miranda clapped her hands together like a delighted child. "It's gorgeous, Margaret. Hardwood floors, granite countertops, even a small balcony for morning coffee." "That sounds lovely, dear," Margaret replied, but I could hear the sadness in her voice. She'd grown attached to having Miranda around, despite everything. "When would you move?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. Derek and Miranda exchanged one of their meaningful glances. "Well," Miranda said carefully, "Derek thinks it would be good for me to have my own space, to really start healing and moving forward." "Of course," I said, "independence is important." What I didn't say was that her leaving would solve several problems. I wouldn't have to watch her manipulate Margaret daily. I wouldn't have to sit across from Derek at my dinner table knowing he'd been sleeping with my daughter-in-law while my son was alive. And most importantly, I could figure out what to do with the evidence I discovered without worrying about her overhearing phone calls or finding documents. But Miranda wasn't finished with her announcement. "There is one small issue," she continued, her voice taking on that vulnerable tone she used when she wanted something. "The apartment requires first month's rent, last month's rent, and a security deposit. It's about $4,000 total." The silence stretched across the dinner table. Margaret set down her fork, understanding immediately what Miranda was asking. "I hate to even bring it up," Miranda continued, "but most of my money is still tied up in Thomas's estate. The lawyers say it could be months before everything is settled." Another lie. I'd seen Thomas's will and insurance papers when Miranda first moved in. The estate was straightforward, and the insurance money should have been available within weeks of filing the claim. Derek reached over and took Miranda's hand. I offered to help, but Miranda insists on handling her own finances. Very independent woman. The way he said it, with pride and admiration, made me want to throw him out of my house immediately. Here was a man praising the independence of a woman who was currently asking her dead husband's parents for money to fund her new life with him. $4,000, Margaret repeated thoughtfully. "Edward, we could—" "Of course we can help," I interrupted, watching Miranda's face carefully. "Consider it a housewarming gift." The relief that flooded Miranda's expression was telling. She'd been confident we would say yes, but not certain. She understood that she was pushing the boundaries of our generosity. "Oh, Edward, thank you so much," she gushed. "I promise I'll pay you back as soon as the insurance comes through." "No need," I said. "Family helps family." I emphasized the word family slightly, wanting to see if it would make her flinch. It didn't. Miranda was too practiced at this game. After dinner, while Margaret walked Derek to his car, I found myself alone with Miranda in the kitchen. She was loading the dishwasher, humming softly to herself, completely relaxed now that she'd secured the money she needed. "Miranda," I said quietly, "can I ask you something?" She looked up, her expression open and trusting. "Of course." "Were you happy with Thomas?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. For just a moment her mask slipped, and I saw something cold flash across her features before she recovered. "What do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I asked. Were you happy in your marriage?" She set down the plate she'd been holding and turned to face me fully. "Edward, that's a strange question. Of course I was happy. I loved Thomas. But were you happy?" I pressed. "Or did you feel trapped, unfulfilled, like you were missing something?" Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why are you asking me this?" "Because I've been thinking about Thomas's last few weeks. He seemed distracted, worried about something. I'm wondering if there were problems at home that he didn't want to discuss with me." Miranda's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Surprise, calculation, then something that might have been genuine sadness. "Thomas was under a lot of pressure at work," she said finally. "He was up for partner at the firm, and the competition was intense." "That's probably what you were noticing." It was a reasonable explanation, and it might have been true. But combined with what I'd found in her room, it felt like another layer of deception. "Did he ever talk to you about feeling overwhelmed, about needing change in his life?" "Edward," Miranda said, her voice taking on a warning tone, "I don't understand where these questions are coming from. Thomas is gone. Whatever problems he might have had, they died with him. Wampum, unless those problems contributed to his death." The words hung in the air between us like an accusation. Miranda went very still, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. "What exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything. I'm just trying to understand what happened to my son." "What happened was an accident," she said firmly. "A drunk driver ran a red light. Thomas was in the wrong place at the wrong time. It was senseless and tragic, and no one's fault." Her voice had risen slightly, and I could hear Margaret and Derek coming back through the front door. Miranda quickly turned back to the dishwasher, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "You're right," I said, matching her volume so Margaret wouldn't sense anything was wrong. "Sometimes accidents are just accidents." But as I walked away, I caught Miranda watching me in the reflection of the kitchen window. The expression on her face wasn't grief or confusion. It was fear. That night after Derek left and Miranda had gone upstairs, I sat Margaret down in the living room for a conversation I'd been dreading. "I think we need to talk about Miranda," I began carefully. Margaret looked up from her knitting. "What about her? Don't you think her behavior has been unusual for someone who lost her husband so recently?" Margaret set down her needles and sighed. "Edward, we've discussed this. People grieve differently. Maybe having Derek in her life is helping her cope. Maybe. Or maybe there's something else going on." "Like what?" I considered telling her everything. About the letters, the insurance policy, the timeline that suggested Miranda had been planning her exit from the marriage long before Thomas died. But Margaret had been through enough trauma. She didn't need to know that the woman we'd been caring for might have been involved in our son's death. "I just think we should be careful," I said instead. "We don't really know Miranda that well. Thomas and she were only married 4 years, and we didn't see much of them as a couple." Margaret frowned. "She's been living in our house for 2 months, Edward. I think I know her pretty well by now." "Do you? Can you honestly say you understand what she's thinking? What she really wants?" "I think she wants to heal and move on with her life. And I think you're being suspicious because you're having trouble letting go of Thomas." It was a fair point, and probably what any reasonable person would think. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Miranda was playing a long game, that everything from her tears at the funeral to her request for money tonight was part of a carefully orchestrated plan. "Maybe you're right," I said, not wanting to push the conversation further. "Maybe I am having trouble letting go, but letting go was the last thing I intended to do." The next morning, I drove to the office of Daniel Reeves, Thomas's lawyer and my old fishing buddy. Dan had handled our family's legal affairs for 15 years, and I trusted him to give me straight answers. "Edward," he said, rising from behind his desk to shake my hand. "Good to see you. How are you holding up?" "As well as can be expected," I replied, settling into the leather chair across from his desk. "I wanted to ask you about Thomas's estate. Miranda mentioned that things are tied up, that it might be months before she receives the insurance money." Dan frowned, pulling a file from his cabinet. "That's not accurate. The estate was straightforward, and the insurance claim was processed weeks ago. Miranda should have received a check for $500,000 by now." My stomach clenched. $500,000? "Yes. Thomas had increased his policy earlier this year. Didn't Miranda tell you about the payout? She mentioned the insurance, but not the amount. And she said the money wasn't available yet." Dan's expression grew concerned. "Edward, I sent that check to Miranda personally 3 weeks ago. She signed for it at your address. 3 weeks ago, Miranda had been crying to Margaret about money troubles, accepting our financial support for groceries and personal expenses. 3 weeks ago, she'd been playing the struggling widow while sitting on $500,000. Is there any chance there was a problem with the check, that it bounced or was delayed? Dan shook his head. I called the insurance company to verify. The check was deposited into Miranda's account the same day she received it. I sat back in my chair, processing this information. Miranda wasn't just lying about her relationship with Derek or her feelings about Thomas. She was lying about money, manipulating our sympathy to extract additional financial support while hiding her actual wealth. Dan, I said carefully, what do you know about the insurance policy itself? When was it increased? He consulted his files. Thomas came in February 28th to update his beneficiaries and increase the coverage. Said he wanted to make sure Miranda would be taken care of if anything happened to him. Did he seem worried about something specific? Dan paused, considering the question. He seemed anxious, more serious than usual. I asked if everything was all right, and he said he'd been thinking about responsibility, about making sure he'd provided for his family. My heart ached thinking about Thomas in those final weeks, possibly knowing his marriage was in trouble, trying to ensure Miranda would be financially secure even if she left him. My son had been a good man, generous and caring, and Miranda had exploited those qualities. Dan, I need to ask you something, and I need you to keep this conversation confidential. He nodded. Of course. If someone suspected insurance fraud, or if there were questions about the circumstances surrounding a policyholder's death, what would be the process for investigating? Dan's eyes sharpened. Edward, are you suggesting? I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just asking hypothetically. He was quiet for a long moment. Hypothetically, if there were evidence of fraud or foul play, the insurance company would launch an investigation. They have their own investigators, and they work closely with law enforcement when necessary. What kind of evidence would they need? Proof of misrepresentation on the application, evidence that the policyholder's death wasn't accidental, or documentation showing the beneficiary had motive and opportunity. It's a high bar, Edward. These companies don't like paying out large claims, so they investigate thoroughly before they do. I thanked Dan and left his office with more questions than answers. Miranda had the motive, freedom from her marriage, and $500,000. She'd had opportunity, access to Thomas's schedule, knowledge of his routines, but proving she'd actually done anything beyond lie and cheat would require evidence I didn't have. As I drove home, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to wait for more evidence. I wasn't going to build a legal case or involve the authorities. I was going to confront Miranda directly tonight, when Derek was there to witness it. I was going to lay out everything I knew and watch her reaction, and then I was going to make sure she understood that her time in my house, and possibly her time pretending to be the grieving widow, was over. Because if Miranda thought she could manipulate my family, steal our money, and dishonor my son's memory without consequences, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. I spent the entire day planning what I would say to Miranda. How do you confront someone about betraying your dead son? How do you present evidence of manipulation and lies without losing control of your own emotions? By 5 o'clock, I had rehearsed the conversation a dozen times in my head, but I still felt unprepared for what was about to happen. Derek arrived at 6:30 as usual, carrying flowers and wearing his characteristic confident smile. Miranda greeted him at the door with a kiss that lasted longer than appropriate for our living room, but I no longer cared about her lack of propriety. Tonight was about truth, not manners. Dinner was Margaret's pot roast with roasted vegetables, one of her specialties. We made small talk about Derek's work, Miranda's apartment hunting, the unusually warm weather for May. I watched them across the table, noting how comfortably they interacted, how naturally they finished each other's sentences. This wasn't a new relationship born from Miranda's grief. This was an established couple who had been together for months. The apartment paperwork should be ready by Friday, Derek said, cutting into his roast. We can move you in over the weekend if you'd like. That's wonderful, Margaret said, though I could hear the sadness in her voice. We'll miss having you here, Miranda. Miranda reached across the table and squeezed Margaret's hand. I'll miss you, too. You've been like a mother to me during the hardest time of my life." The manipulation was so smooth, so practiced, that I almost admired her skill, even as it disgusted me. Margaret's eyes filled with tears at the sweet words, completely unaware that she was being played. "Actually," I said, setting down my fork, "before we talk about apartments, I think we need to discuss something else." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Miranda's smile faltered slightly, and Derek looked between us with confusion. "What's that, Edward?" Miranda asked, her voice carefully neutral. I reached into my jacket pocket and pulled out printed copies of the photographs I'd taken in her room. I placed them on the table between the salt and pepper shakers, where everyone could see them clearly. The silence that followed was deafening. Miranda went white as she recognized the documents. Derek leaned forward, trying to read the papers upside down. Margaret looked confused, not understanding what she was seeing. "Edward," Miranda said carefully, "what are these?" "I think you know exactly what they are," I replied. "Love letters from Derek, dated months before Thomas died. An insurance application that you filled out, increasing Thomas's policy to $500,000 just weeks before his accident." Derek's face had gone ashen. He stared at the letters with the expression of a man watching his life implode. "You went through my private things?" Miranda's voice was rising, indignation replacing fear. "You had no right." "I had every right," I cut her off. "This is my house, and you're a guest here, a guest who has been lying to us from the moment you walked through our door." Margaret was picking up the letters now, her hands shaking as she read Derek's words of love and longing. Her face crumpled as she understood what she was seeing. "Miranda," Margaret whispered, "you were having an affair." "It's not what it looks like," Miranda said quickly, but her voice lacked conviction. "Really?" I pulled out my phone and showed her the screen. "Because I also called Thomas's lawyer today. The insurance money came through 3 weeks ago. $500,000 deposited directly into your account. Yet you've been asking us for money, crying about financial hardship, accepting our charity while sitting on $500,000. Derek started to stand up. "I think I should leave." "Sit down," I said firmly. "You're part of this conversation." He sat back down reluctantly, his face flushed with embarrassment and guilt. "How long?" Margaret asked, her voice barely audible. "How long were you cheating on our son?" Miranda's composure finally cracked. "You don't understand what it was like being married to Thomas. He was so focused on work, so ambitious. He never had time for me, never made me feel like a priority. So you decided to find someone who would," I said coldly. "And when Thomas became inconvenient, you made sure he wouldn't be a problem anymore." "Edward," Margaret gasped, "you can't be suggesting—" "I'm not suggesting anything," I said. "I'm stating facts. Miranda was having an affair. She increased Thomas's life insurance policy weeks before he died. She immediately moved in with us, playing the grieving widow while secretly continuing her relationship with her lover. And now she's planning to move into an apartment with the money from my son's death." Miranda stood up abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. "You're insane if you think I had anything to do with Thomas's accident. A drunk driver killed him. It was random, senseless." "Was it?" I stood up as well, my voice growing louder. "Or did you know his schedule? Did you know he'd be at that intersection at that exact time?" "This is ridiculous," Derek interjected, finally finding his voice. "Miranda would never hurt anyone. You're grieving and looking for someone to blame, but don't you dare lecture me about grief." I turned on him. "You were sleeping with my son's wife while he was alive. You were making plans for her future while he was still breathing. Whatever grief I'm feeling, you helped cause it." The room fell silent except for the sound of Margaret crying softly. She was still holding the love letters, staring at them as if they might disappear. Miranda sank back into her chair, her defiance crumbling. "You want to know the truth?" she said, her voice hollow. "Fine. Yes, I was unhappy in my marriage. Yes, I was having an affair with Derek. Yes, I was planning to leave Thomas." Margaret's sob was audible. "But I never wanted him to die," Miranda continued. "Never. The insurance policy was Derek's idea. He said if I was going to leave Thomas anyway, I should make sure I'd be financially secure. But I never imagined—" She trailed off, but the implication hung in the air like smoke. "You never imagined Thomas would die so conveniently," I finished for her. You never imagined you'd be able to skip the messy divorce and go straight to the insurance payout? It wasn't like that, she whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. Derek was staring at her with something approaching horror. Miranda, you never told me about increasing the insurance policy. Because I knew you'd react like this, she snapped. Like everyone else, you'd assume the worst. The worst? I laughed bitterly. Miranda, you manipulated my grief, exploited my wife's kindness, and dishonored my son's memory. I'm not assuming anything. I'm seeing you exactly as you are. I walked around the table until I was standing directly in front of her chair. Here's what's going to happen. You're going to pack your things tonight and leave this house. You're going to repay every cent we've given you since you moved in, and you're going to stay away from my family. You can't just kick me out, Miranda protested. I have rights. You have no rights here, I said firmly. You're a guest who has overstayed her welcome. If you're not gone by morning, I'll call the police and have you removed. On what grounds? I leaned down until my face was level with hers. On the grounds that I have evidence you've been lying to us for months. Evidence that suggests you might have been involved in insurance fraud. Evidence that raises questions about the circumstances of my son's death. Miranda went very still. You're bluffing. Try me. We stared at each other for a long moment, and I saw the exact moment when she realized I wasn't backing down. The fear in her eyes was genuine now, not the calculated vulnerability she'd been performing for months. Fine, she said, standing up with as much dignity as she could muster. I'll leave. But you're making a mistake, Edward. I love Thomas, no matter what you believe. If you loved him, I said quietly, you wouldn't have betrayed him. You wouldn't have been planning to leave him. And you sure as hell wouldn't have dishonored his memory by lying to his parents. Miranda looked at Margaret, who was still crying silently over the letters. Margaret, you have to believe me. I never meant for any of this to hurt you. Margaret looked up, her face streaked with tears. Get out, she whispered. Just get out of my house. Miranda flinched as if she'd been slapped. She turned to Derek, who was staring at the table, unable to meet her eyes. Derek? He shook his head slowly. I can't do this, Miranda. I can't be part of this anymore. What are you saying? I'm saying I need time to think about us, about everything. He stood up and headed for the door. I'll call you tomorrow. After he left, Miranda stood alone in our dining room, surrounded by the evidence of her lies. For a moment, she looked like the broken woman who had sobbed at Thomas's funeral, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. I'll need until tomorrow to pack, she said finally. You have until noon, I replied. He nodded and walked upstairs without another word. Margaret and I sat in the kitchen until nearly midnight, not talking much, just processing what had happened. She asked me once if I really thought Miranda had been involved in Thomas's death, and I told her honestly that I didn't know. But I also told her that it didn't matter. Whether Miranda had caused the accident or simply been prepared to profit from it, she had betrayed our son and manipulated our grief. The next morning, Miranda was gone before we woke up. She left no note, no forwarding address. The guest room was stripped bare, as if she had never been there at all. But she had been there, and the damage was real. Margaret struggled for weeks with feelings of betrayal and foolishness. She blamed herself for not seeing through Miranda's act, for being taken in by tears and vulnerability that might have been completely fake. It took months for us to return to some semblance of normal life. We sold Thomas's apartment, donating his personal items to charity rather than let Miranda claim them. We visited his grave regularly, finally able to grieve without the contamination of Miranda's presence. I never pursued the questions about the insurance policy or the accident. I had no proof of wrongdoing beyond lies and infidelity, and reopening the investigation would have meant more pain for Margaret. Some truths are too heavy to bear, and some justice isn't worth the cost. But I keep the letters and documents in my desk drawer, just in case. And sometimes late at night I think about my son's last few weeks, wondering if he knew what was coming, if he suspected his wife's betrayal. I hope he didn't. I hope Thomas died believing he was loved, believing his marriage was real, believing his future was secure, because in the end, that might be the only peace any of us can find in this mess. The peace that comes from protecting the memory of the dead, even when the living have done everything they can to destroy it. Miranda got her money and her freedom, but she lost something more valuable, the chance to be part of a family that would have loved her forever, if only she had been worthy of it. And that, I suppose, will have to be justice enough.